Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Gary Aubin. I work with the Education Endowment Foundation for 2 days a week, and my day job, I suppose, I lead on send provision for a multi-academy trust that's 10 schools in London and Hertfordshire. And I've been invited to just contribute today to talk about how Senkos and school leaders can make sure that send becomes everyone's responsibility, with a real focus on middle leaders and with a particular focus on curriculum and phase leads. So although I'm sorry not to be able to be with you today, I hope I say something that you can take away and find useful. Just a quick introduction to the work of the EEF for those who may not be familiar with it. So it's committed and dedicated to breaking that link between family income and educational achievement that shows that if you are from a more deprived or disadvantaged background, then you'll be making less progress than other students, and that will increase over time as you go through the school system. So the EEF wants to break that cycle, and one of the ways it likes to do it in particular is through the use of evidence. So what it does is it generates evidence. It tries to synthesize evidence rather, to make it useful for schools and school leaders, and then to make sure that can be mobilized through the Research Schools Network and through schools doing the work on the ground. So the idea is that it makes evidence, or good evidence, robust evidence around what works within teaching and learning, more available and accessible to schools and school leaders and teachers, so that they might ultimately support the outcomes of children learning in schools, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So that's the work of the EEF in a nutshell. The EEF does some work that's explicitly around SEND. So it offers, for example, a deep dive into the evidence around SEND. It has SEND as a thread that runs through other training programs that it offers. It also, as part of its desire to increase the research and the evidence base, commissions research trials. So currently, the whole school SEND review guides are part of a trial nationally to see if when schools engage with these review guides and engage with the whole school SEND program, their outcomes for pupils with SEND improve over time. It also does currently review trials around a couple of intervention programs in particular there. And one piece of work that's done really that I'd like to talk a bit more about today is it conducted a big evidence review around SEND. So it asked several questions around what are useful things for schools to do to support the outcomes of students with SEND. And so it conducted this evidence review, which involved looking at lots and lots of meta-analyses, over 100 meta-analyses, incorporating thousands of studies that have taken place already around what works for students with SEND, to then synthesize those into something and some recommendations that schools can take forward and find very useful. So that ultimately created the SEN in Mainstream guidance report that you may be familiar with, and if you're not, it's on the EEF website. Please do go and have a look at it. And alongside that guidance report are various tools that schools may be able to use when they're working with staff around that school's SEND provision. And there are some blogs and things, of which there are links to 3 on the slide you can see now, that schools might find useful. So that's some of the work that EEF does within SEND. And I talked about the SEN and Mainstream guidance report, and these are 5 recommendations that it came up with, that schools should be doing these 5 things because that's what the evidence strongly suggests is going to make a difference. These are not sort of top of the head thoughts. This is based on really good evidence in many cases around what works for students to SEND. So just to shine a light on those 5 in particular, it's about, number 1, that positive and supportive environment for pupils. Number 2 is about the understanding of pupils and their needs. Number 3, about accessing high quality teaching. Number 4 is about doing some really good and carefully selected interventions. And number 5 is around working with teaching assistants. So I won't try and go through all of them today, because I do want to have that focus on curriculum and phase leads in particular. But I want to talk a bit more about ensuring that all pupils have access to high quality teaching, because I believe personally that that's the greatest thing, that many other issues don't become issues if the teaching is great and accessible and allows all students a chance to succeed and to be challenged. So fewer EHCP applications need to be written if the classroom teaching is going well. Fewer interventions need to be run if the classroom teaching is going well. Even fewer teaching assistants might be needed across your school if the teaching is meeting the needs of all learners. So that's ultimately what we want to try and do. So that's why I want to just shine that light on number 3 a little bit now. So the SEN and Mainstream Guidance Report, I've just taken 3 bullet points and then 5 little particular approaches that it highlights, and I'll just pause for a moment to allow you to read those. So what it's not saying is that this is the answer to everything. There may be a child who's autistic for whom a now and next board is absolutely essential and isn't covered by these 5 approaches that are written here. And there'll be many examples. If a child has a visual impairment and needs a certain font size in order to access written materials, well, there's no getting around that. But what this does do with these 5 approaches is say, look, they're already in the repertoire of many teachers, and if teachers can use them with a bit of a nuance for students with SEND, but really using them consistently for students with SEND and others, this is what the evidence shows can make a positive difference for students. So those 5 things are flexible grouping, cognitive and metacognitive strategies, explicit instruction, using technology to support pupils with SEND, and scaffolding. So I won't talk in detail about all of them. But what I'd just like to do is consider, well, if we know what works, if we know what's going to be useful, which is some combination of these 5 approaches, that's going to help more students with SEND to make good academic progress in school and to feel more successful in the class, be more successful in the class. Well, we know. So, let's say we know that. We know what the evidence certainly suggests will make a positive difference. We also know that Senkos can't do it alone. If we look at these quotes here, the first one is that no school can be outstanding if it's not inclusive. And the second one, which I think is particularly pertinent here, it's now the responsibility of all leaders and teachers to ensure that the needs of SEND pupils are being fully met. So Senkos shouldn't be doing this on their own. It's got to be everyone's responsibility. So we must increase the number of classrooms in which high quality teaching meets the needs of all learners. But we can't do it alone, clearly. So I'd like to share 3 things in the time I've got this afternoon. So the first is a framework for considering why people may not easily change their behavior. So it's sort of abstract, but a useful lens with which to sort of see that it's possible that colleagues aren't working against you, and there may be some reasons why they're not working with you that can be addressed. The second one is around, is just highlighting the recommendations from the EEF's most recent guidance report, which is effective professional development. So if Senkos or school leaders are planning effective PD around SEND, actually, what are the principles, the mechanisms to make sure that can be successful? And the final thing is some sort of practical suggestions for working with curriculum and phase leads. So in those 3 things, starting fairly abstract and hopefully moving towards something very, very concrete and practical that you'll be able to think about doing in your work in schools. So to start with number 1 then. So this is, we can sometimes feel like colleagues are working against us. And often we give the benefit of the doubt and we go, well, they're very busy. But actually we feel like their priorities aren't quite our priorities. And there's this thing called the Aubin model, which I think is a really useful way to look at that behavior and the behavior of colleagues, because behavior change is enormously difficult, can be enormously difficult to achieve. And so when looking at that question, why isn't it easy to change people's behavior? It highlights 3 things there. Sometimes people don't either show the behavior that you want or change to the behavior that you need, for example, a particular strategy to adopt within their teaching, for 3 reasons. One is they don't have the capability to do it. So they don't know how that thing can be done. So, and often when we see any hesitancy from colleagues, it's actually an insecurity, isn't it? Because I don't know how I could do that well. I don't know how I could incorporate that into what I normally do. So I won't do it. So it's that capability issue. Another one is motivation. If you may think it's the most important thing for dual coding to take place as part of the teacher exposition from the front of the classroom, but actually, unless your colleague believes that, they're not going to have that effort to change their own resources, their own slides, their own way of teaching. And if you're a curriculum or phase lead, actually, you've really got to buy into that, because you then, as a let's say a head of geography in a secondary or a head of Key Stage 2 in a primary, you then may need to try and affect the behavior of 5, 6, 7 staff. So, you really need to be bought in and have the motivation and believe that that is a useful thing that's worth doing. And then finally, the opportunity. So it may be that individual colleague that you're working with around their teaching, they have the ability to do what you're saying. They have the motivation. They can see that it's a good idea, but they know that if their head of department or a member of SLT or someone comes into the lesson tomorrow, they will say, no, we don't do that here. Please don't do that. And then, so actually it's the opportunity. They are able to, they want to, but there are other more external factors that don't allow them the opportunity to do so. So I won't say any more about this combi model other than to say, and I appreciate that that's a sort of fairly abstract way to start, but I think it's just a useful way for thinking. If we're trying to get colleagues to behave in a certain way, i.e. to look at the pupil profiles, these summaries of students' needs, and make sure that their English department are looking at them and teaching in a way that is influenced by them, that if the head of English is not doing that, for example, well, it may not be they're working against you. It may be you need to think about whether they don't have the capability. So, for example, the pupil profile, the strategies you're recommending actually are quite full of jargon and things they don't understand. Could be they don't have the capability, the motivation, or they don't have the opportunity. So please just consider colleagues' behaviour in one of those three ways. And if we think people aren't motivated to make the change that I'm recommending here, then that's what we go ahead and we work on before we proceed. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing I'd like to share is what the evidence says around effective professional development. So there's a bit too much on here for me to read all of, but there are three. I'll just read the headlines on it. So there are three recommendations that come out of the guidance report for effective professional development. So again, this is looking at hundreds of studies around successful PD and unsuccessful PD programs. So it says that actually what you do in particular isn't necessarily the most important thing. Whether you use instructional coaching or lesson study or others, that may not be the most important thing. It's about the mechanisms that are that's the thing that's going to make a difference. And then the second recommendation in yellow talks about what those mechanisms are and talks about choosing one perhaps from each of four different groups. So this bit of research identified that successful professional development programs did things from four different subcategories, if you like. So they made sure that within their professional development program, there was something that built the knowledge of the people who you expected to go and do the thing. There was something that motivated staff to make that change. There's something that helped them to develop the technique, whatever it is you're asking them to do. And there was something that that then supported them to embed that practice to make sure it wasn't a one-off event. So if you are as a SENCO or a school leader invested in thinking about SEND, actually, if you want to make a change and you've identified what that change is, what you think you'd like colleagues to do more of or less of, then actually having one thing from each of those four subcategories is going to be a way to give your PD program the best chance of it being successful based on the evidence that exists out there at the moment. And then finally, that it's done thinking about the context of the school and thinking about whether if you're trying to make a change where there are six other bits of change that teachers are being encouraged to make, then that's clearly going to be too much. So it's thinking about actually what else is going on in this school, where is my school, and if and what becomes an appropriate piece as well as method of professional development. So the challenge for SENCOs and SEND leaders really is then if we know the mechanisms that are going to be useful for helping colleagues to change their practice in whatever we're trying to change, whatever we're trying to let them do more of. Then I should have given the example here of these 5 strategies that the EEF's research found work for students with SEN in mainstream settings, flexible grouping, etc. You'll see just between those orange lines there. Then the thing to go away and reflect on, I think, as SENCOs and SEND leaders is, can I build a program? Can I do something in my school that means I take the mechanisms and I help staff to implement some of those 5 strategies? There's 5 a day, 5 things that teachers can use in their classroom to help more students with SEND succeed in the mainstream class. Okay, so I'll move on from that, and clearly that doesn't provide you with answers, only questions, and I will talk in slightly less abstract terms in a moment, but just to reflect, firstly, we've talked about that combi model where people aren't showing the behavior or making the behavior changes that you're looking for. It could be about them lacking the capability, motivation, or ability to opportunity rather to make those changes. And if you're trying to help colleagues to make those changes, doing it in line with the evidence around good PD programs. But to speak Finally, in slightly less abstract ways, then I'll talk more practical, concrete suggestions for working with curriculum and phase leads. So what I'm assuming is that I'm talking here to Senkos and Sen leads from across primary and secondary. And so the kind of colleagues we're looking at will be heads of early years, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and as well as potentially literacy and numeracy leads. And then in secondary schools, we're talking about often heads of department, sometimes heads of year, but really with an academic focus particularly. Slightly different ways of working, perhaps, when working with pastoral leads for pastoral benefits explicitly, and really focusing on how we can change classroom practice and ensure maximum academic sort of support and progress for students with SEND. So the first thing to do, I think, as a Senko, Send leader, is to work out what you want from your curriculum or phase leads. So often that just means going back to your priorities and going, okay, what am I trying to drive this year in particular? Is it about an explicit focus on the teaching of vocabulary in all classrooms, for example? Is it about a focus on reading? Is it a focus on participation within class discussion and having 100% of students following sort of, taking part in classroom discussion? So the first thing is articulating really what you want from curriculum and phase leads. We can be quite sort of generic and say we want every student with SEND to be thriving in every classroom. And of course that is correct. But actually having a slightly more granular focus on what the changes that you're looking for will be a bit more helpful. And I think will empower curriculum and phase leads to know that they don't need to be the Senko. They're not being asked to be the Senko. They're being asked to support a specific teaching and learning related change within the classrooms that they ultimately have some responsibility for. So work out what you want from them, work out what change you want to see, and then how you think that curriculum or phase leads can support you with that. Okay, you then want to find a way where you can work together so that success benefits both of you. So I talked in that combi model about motivation potentially being the reason why people don't enact the behaviors that you want. So if I'm the head of Key Stage 1 and everything's going swimmingly and all students with SEND or otherwise are doing well and behavior's good, students are attending school well, they are making good progress and engaging well. Actually, why do I want to, what's my motivation for making the change that you want me to enact there? But actually, if you can find a way where success benefits both of you, that's going to be the most helpful thing to get buy-in there. So, for example, a head of geography, it may be that if students with SEND aren't making good progress, aren't expected to make good progress by the end of Key Stage 4, based on their Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 4 progress scores, then actually that will bring down the progress scores for the whole of the geography department. And that's not in the head of geography's interest, clearly. So if you have or find or get that data and can see that actually students with SEND who aren't doing so well in geography, then there's a win-win there. If you can work with that head of geography, they're going to naturally be bought into the change you're going to encourage, as long as it's good change, because they'll see that will make a difference to the classrooms that they have responsibility for, and ultimately for the grades that students get. And likewise, if self-regulation is an issue within year 4, there are a few students who are struggling to self-regulate, then working with the Key Stage 2 phase lead around a classroom environment that supports self-regulation, that's going to be a win-win, because the teachers who work within Key Stage 2 are going to be better able to teach with classrooms where students are regulated, are calm, are ready for learning. So that's going to be a win-win. I think the problem Senkos sometimes have is where they try and solve these problems on their own. They forget that there are middle leaders who are responsible as well for a certain cohorts, like students who pick geography or students in Key Stage 2. So they try and either do these things on their own, or they don't find ways that are going to be mutually beneficial. And that's what I think this should promote here. So working together so that success benefits both of you. Okay, the next, hopefully very practical and doable, pragmatic sort of point here is about finding ways to sustain any partnership work, so it's not a one-off event. So I talked perhaps about geography and data, so that might be a good example. The grades in the middle of year 10 show actually that students with SEND in geography aren't doing so well. So, you might send the head of geography an email and say, oh, a bit worried about this, what should we do? Well, here's a bit of, here's some strategies that you can try and enact in your department, and let me know if you have any problems. And clearly that's unlikely to be an approach that makes real change, because it's one-off, it's coming without much guidance, and and clearly that's what's needed. So where it's partnership work, it should be okay. Well, do we have? Do you meet as a Senko perhaps with every middle leader every half term for a discussion on the progress of students with SEND in particular, from early years right the way up to Key Stage 5? Would that be a good approach? Every middle leader every half term, for example, would that be a way to sustain it? Would it be that there is something that happens annually with every leader with a responsibility, and it's a piece of work that takes sort of perhaps over 2 or 3 weeks, and then is revisited later in the year, but is essentially an annual focus on each phase or each department within the school. And I think going back to the EEF guidance on effective professional development is a good place to return to with this, to go, okay, what are those ways that I can make sure that any professional development or any change I want to see isn't just a one-off event, but can be sustained. Okay, so it's about making it sustained rather than a one-off event. The next one here is about making your work systematic. So using existing systems where they exist and building new ones where you need to. So for example, if you want to make some changes with middle leaders, what happens already that mean you don't need to try and build momentum of those things? So are there meeting cycles? Do the middle leaders meet as a whole group once every half term, the phase leads, the curriculum leads? And what you need to do is just make sure that the relevant member of SLT or the head teacher, whoever it is who sort of leads and organizes those meetings, knows that you should be a part of them, certainly to attend and hopefully to present, to share, to lead sections also. So is there a system of meetings that is going to help you to achieve the behavior change that you want? Now, change doesn't happen just in meetings, of course. So if there's monitoring cycles, learning walks and observations and that kind of thing, actually, are you as a Senko involved in those? I know I'm talking to some Senkos here, not all, but is the Senko involved in those? And so where those systems of monitoring already exist, the Senko isn't trying to add work to anyone, they're just trying to get in on the work that's already existing. And likewise, if your school does a sort of an annual review of a certain key stage or review of a certain subject area, sometimes as a Senko, it's just making sure you're involved in that rather than it happening and then you having to do something else separately. It could be that there are progress sort of there's progress monitoring meetings that happen between every phase lead or curriculum lead and the head teacher every term. So again, should the Senko sit in on those every single time they happen, or on some of them, or on particular department areas or phases where there are some concerns around SEND? So how is the Senko or SEND leaders involved in that process there? And then where learning walks are happening, are they happening jointly? Because it's all well for the Senko to go around, look at lots of Year 7 classes and then send an email back to the head of Year 7, but actually going around with the head of Year 7 jointly and going, okay, do we agree, or do we see eye to eye that this is the issue and these are the things we can change, and then we can make a plan for how to change them. So it may be some joint action planning with the head of whatever. It's going to be a useful next step here. So we've seen this, we've agreed on joint sort of review of what's going on in your area. Here's 5 actions that we both agree are useful. Now let's work at who's going to do them and when we're going to come back to these. So it's just about trying to find those systems that already exist. And if you need to build new systems, then maybe you just need to. Maybe you need your Senko to be going every month and there's a particular lens on a different area of the school, and it's every month I work with a certain curriculum department who wants to be first. And if that becomes a system, it then becomes expected that you work with every single head of phase or head of curriculum for a certain length of time every year, and that's revisited at other times of the year. So you may need to build your own system, but where a system already exists, let's use those wherever we can. And the final point for me is to reflect on how explicit and how clear you've been. So if we're looking at working with colleagues, we really can't afford to have SEND as a sort of mystified thing that people don't understand. But we also can't expect everyone to have a master's level education in SEND in order to be able to understand what we're talking about. So things like where you've shared information, have you shared it well, or is it hidden on some secret area of your staff intranet that is going to be impossible to find? Things like where we've got a 1-page summary of a pupil's needs and some strategies, actually for a layman or a teacher, non-SEND specialist looking at those, are they implementable? Are they even comprehensible? Do they understand what you're asking them to do and what you're saying the students' needs are? If we're talking about receptive and expressive language scores, okay, well, I would bet that most staff actually they might be able to work it out, but they don't explicitly know what those things mean. Many teaching staff and TAs. So actually, making sure that you've written things on, if we expect people to do something, you've made it really clear what that is. And that also comes back to the priorities, as I mentioned earlier. If you think, if you've identified that reading, vocabulary, non-invasive behavior management, whatever the thing is that you've identified as an issue across your school or across pockets of your school, actually, have you articulated that really clearly? Sometimes all you might need to say to a really good head of department or head of phase is students are struggling with X, and I think we all need to do Y. And really good head of phase, a really good head of phase, a really good head of department will take that on, take that seriously, listen to what you're saying is an issue, and then think about what that means for them in their area. So what I hope I've done this afternoon is to introduce one sort of fairly abstract combi model way of thinking about, well, how do we why does behavior change sometimes not happen? Then something a bit more concrete and very evidence-based around what effective professional development looks like, and how ways that can be successful and be sustained. And then finally looked at some quite practical examples for what you or what you as a Senko or a SEND leader might do to go and work with curriculum and phase leads in a really concrete way. But really where it starts is knowing how you want to use them, know what you want from them, and then we think about how that can happen in practice, what school systems there are, how the combi model might create some blocks, and how a good professional development program might help it to happen in reality. So just to say, my apologies again for not being able to be with you at Whole School Send live today, but my details are on the slide there, and it's been a real pleasure contributing to the session today. Thank you very much.